Good evening. Hello. How's it going out there? I hope you are reading me loud and clear. Testing, testing. One, two, three. This is Nick, creator of Hayes Reviews, and I'm back with another live stream. This is part four of Lusitania by Colin Simpson, a 1972 book that we have been working our way through. We've done 5 chapters, which is pretty good going. And wow, it's an incredible piece of work. It's a small, unassuming paperback, and it's kind of molding as it's 50 years old now at this point. But boy, is it packed with juicy details and information and tidbits about this major historical event, which was part of the lead up and a key part of World War One, in fact. And we kind of channel like to go back and read books and have a look at things and find the continuity helps us understand and explain what is going on in the modern day. If you don't know by now, that is what Hayes Reviews is all about. I'm a bibliophile, and I wanted to share my love of books and also share the information in that I've built up in my library over the last 3 or 4 years. I really felt the censorship and the control of information, particularly online censorship, and the digital nature of information nowadays allows for the rewriting of information and the memory holding and the banning and the deplatforming and all these sorts of things. However, anything about that. Okay, so I just got a message saying OBS has disconnected and reconnected. Now, if you've been watching any of my earlier videos in this series, you will have known that I've been having some tech issues. Hello. Good evening, everybody. Well, it's good evening here in Vietnam. It might be probably good afternoon wherever you are, maybe even good morning. But this is 9 p.m. here, and we have been having some tech issues while we've been trying to read through this book. And so I've relocated to a different room in the house, and this room is closer to the Wi-Fi router, and I'm hoping for a smoother, uninterrupted connection. I watched the previous 2 videos, and there were times where my voice dropped out, or it skipped a word or a sentence, and it didn't quite capture the things I was saying, which is quite frustrating. But I do have a backup plan. I'm recording the video here on my side, and so if it ends up unusable and the live stream is so bad that nobody can make sense of it, or it's too infuriating when you miss words and sentences, then not to worry, I can upload the recording at a later date and we'll get around that problem in that way. So anybody out there tonight, if you can hear me and you're reading me, pop a message in the chat or just let me know somehow. Send a smoke signal or a homing pigeon. You know, we could do it the Rothschild way by send messages to each other by pigeon. That'd be good. Don't forget I'm in Vietnam though, so they need to be international pigeons with very strong wings. They've eaten their Weetabix this morning as well. Okay, so I'm just waiting for a sign that I am audible and somebody out there can hear me. So the book so far has been very interesting, and I was just reviewing part 3, in which I read chapter 3 and 4. And in chapter 4, one of the interesting things that came out of that was how the company that built the Lusitania, and actually this reminds me of another thing I've got to clarify and clear up, because I think I've been mispronouncing the name of this company. A good friend from the Bristol Freedom Cell network in the southwest of the UK got in touch to say that the company is actually pronounced Cunard. And I've been saying Cunard, C-U-N-A-R-D. Cunard is the way it's supposed to be pronounced, apparently. And so, good to know. And I'm going to correct that, hopefully, moving forward, and remember to say Cunard instead of Cunard. So I hope that's helpful and useful and good to know. So yeah, in the last chapter, we learned about how this company was kind of commissioned and funded by the Admiralty, the British Admiralty, to build these record-breaking ships that could travel fastest between Liverpool and New York and do that trip in less than 5 days. And they were decked out with first and second and third class passenger facilities that were just incredible, high standard, and the kind of like a floating hotel. And the deal was that they would fund the creation of these ships so long as if war kicked off, and bear in mind this was at a time when there was a bunch of guys in the British elite scheming and planning to get a world war started, and that story is in Lord Milner's Second War, which I reviewed on this channel, and also in the Hidden History book by Jerry Doherty and McGregor. So, so the Admiralty might have known there was a war coming, is what I'm saying. But they funded the building of these ships, and they said, okay, if war kicks off, then we need to requisition them, and we need to use them in the war effort. And so that was the deal. And they were built and then celebrated, and they had a unique design where most of the ship was above water, but it was like an unusually huge amount of height in these ships, and you can see pictures of them on some articles that I posted on the last video, and people were really awestruck when they saw these things in the harbors and the docks, and so war started. And then they called in the ship and they said, right, we're going to fit it out and we're going to put some guns on it, put some weapons on it, and we're going to stick it in the war. And then there was a decision made, and it was decided not to send the Lusitania into war and instead allow it to keep running its sort of ferry function between Liverpool and New York, because at that time America was neutral and they were supplying munitions and supplies to the Allies. And they were staying out of the war, though. They were just kind of bartering and trading and being providers of materials, war materials. And so it was then realized that Germany were actually having the upper hand, and it was looking like they might win the war. And so they wanted to bring in, they wanted to stop this happening, obviously. And so Winston Churchill hatched a plan. And he came up with a strategy to get America to come into the war. And the strategy was to he realized that if Germany attacked an American ship, then it would be very likely that America would join the war against the Germans. And at the very least, he kind of schemed and he calculated that at the very least it would strengthen the Allies' trading position with America at the time. So it would at least, if they didn't join the war on the side of the Allies, they would at least have a more secure access to the supplies needed to keep the war going and to keep fighting and everything. And so what happened was the ship was told to continue doing this run between Liverpool and New York, and then there was chicanery and tomfoolery happening with the on the docks, because what happened was there's been a sort of confusion about whether or not this ship was carrying munitions. Was it purely and simply a passenger ship, a neutral ship that was just fulfilling a function of taking people back and forth and taking goods back and forth, or, as the Germans alleged, was it actually part of the Allied war effort and being used to transport munitions in order to support the Allies in their fight against the Germans? And so we read in the last chapter all about the sort of polls and the way that J.P. Morgan, the banker, the banking family, stepped in, and they created this kind of elaborate network of shell companies to hide the fact that munitions were indeed being transported back and forth on the Cunard ships. And this had to be sort of hidden and occulted, and they had to use not code words exactly, but they had to use a different way of describing those materials to get them through customs and to get the manifests okayed so that the ships could be moved. And I just did the okay sign there. Don't read into it too much. Because I've been seeing it everywhere these days. I just watched a video with Ivor Cummings the other day, and I really liked that guy throughout the great scam of 2020. And he's released a video which is finally the ultimate Corona debate, uncensored, no punches held, and all the way through it he's like sick. He's just doing that thing all the way through. And so, I don't know, maybe I've just been watching too many Mark Passio videos that now when I see signs and symbols everywhere, it just sets off red flags and my spider sense starts tingling. So if there's anybody out there with an overactive spider sense who's been watching lots and lots of Mark Passio, don't read into it too much. But that is where the story got to. That's where we're up to. And what happened was the Cunard company was people in the company were saying they didn't want to get involved and they weren't comfortable with these munitions being stowed because they were being put on the ship, but the passengers didn't know about it. So they were traveling along, enjoying their trip, and they didn't know that they were sitting on massive amounts of explosives and shells and war weapons and these kind of things, killing implements. And people in Cunard, they weren't happy with it, and one man, I can't remember his name, but he expressed strong sort of opposition, and then they just doubled his salary, paid him off, and then he quieted down and he stopped having a conscience. Suddenly, they doubled his salary from 2,500 a year to 5,000 a year. Boom, like that, and he stopped complaining and he was happy to go along with it. And then the other thing that happened was before they kind of sealed this and paid off the right people and got it in place, and in order to make it happen, there was sort of a slander campaign, a smear campaign waged against the company, in which all these reports were produced alleging the company's kind of sympathy with the Germans, and how there was lots of people who looked German hanging around the docks, and lots of trying to paint this sort of picture that the company must be in some way, the enemy, supporting the enemy, and sympathetic with the Germans, because it wasn't willing, because it wanted to stay neutral and it didn't want to be used to transport these weapons back and forth. So that's kind of where we got up to. Obviously, that was my whistle-stop tour of what has been so far an intensely jam-packed book. There's so much detail, and it's one of those sort of stories and narratives which is very gripping and very well researched. As Colin Simpson told us in the intro, he didn't fancy diving down to the wreckage of the Lusitania to find out whether or not it did indeed have munitions aboard. So what he did instead was he dived into the archives of the businesses and the companies and the governments, the wartime records, and the Cunard archive itself, in order to get that information and understand what was happening, and found a lot of conflicting, confusing, misdirected information. For example, the manifests, the cargo manifests, none of them made sense. None of them lined up. They're all different. They're all copies. The original, I don't think he could track down an original one, or at least if he did, not the most original, but I think the most sort of reliable one turned out to be in the possession of, was it Franklin D. Roosevelt, I think, which was curious. And so he's really gone to look at the paper trail, and this is what I've said many times I love about these kind of books. 1972, he didn't have Wikipedia to do his research. He didn't have ChatGPT to spit out the facts and the things he needed to know. He had to do the legwork, go into the records, the dusty boxes of old pieces of paper, and trawl through them and sift through all that information to kind of find out what was going on. So real detective work, and this is part of what I love about books, is that each one of them is a labor of love. Each one of them somebody has poured blood, sweat, and tears into, or at least that used to be the case before we could get large language models to write them for us. So it's a lot easier to write books nowadays than it used to be, and I think for that reason it's why I really like the old books. But anyway, that is enough from me. That's enough preamble. I don't have any extra sort of resources to put on your radar at the beginning of this show. I've had a bit of time off. I did 3 in a row last week, but it was the run up to Tet, Lunar New Year. But now the holidays and the festivities and the celebrations, that is all wrapped up and over with. And so we've just got the rest of our holiday here in Vietnam, about a week and a half to look forward to. And so I thought, now that I've got a bit of downtime, we could get back on with reading the book. And I'm sure everybody watching this is saying, yes, Nick, shut up. Let's go over to the book, because that is what we're here for. And I don't blame you for thinking that or feeling that. So here we are. This is Lusitania by Colin Simpson. So I haven't had any messages in the chat. I'm just going to assume that this is going out loud and clear. People can hear me who are watching. And if not, then there's going to be a recording. And so I can watch it back afterwards. So we're all good in that regard. But let's dive into it. Lusitania. So you can see we've got a lot of this book left. This little green tab here, that is all notes and index and bibliography. And we've still got a lot to go, a lot to learn, and a lot more to find out about the story. So this is probably going to end up being quite a long series of videos. but much longer if I keep rambling. So let's get into it. Let's continue with chapter 5. And so I apologize, actually the lighting is a little bit harder in this room. I don't have a handy desk lamp to illuminate my face, and so I might be battling with shadows coming from various places, but I think that is clear and you should be able to see and read that. So, chapter 5. The Port of New York provided an appropriate background for the operation of the British and German intelligence services. The concentrated and cosmopolitan character of the city, the presence of large and vocal German and Irish communities initially favoured the German service, headed by Captain Franz von Papen, military attaché at the German embassy, whose later career took him briefly to the German chancellorship, and his colleagues, the naval attaché, Captain Boyed. Their policies, which were essentially within the unspoken rules of diplomatic espionage, were eventually to prove too subtle to appeal to their superiors in Berlin, while the arrogance of both men made them increasingly unpopular with the Americans. It was an unpopularity based both on their physical appearance and on their almost incredible snobbishness. Both were tall, urbane, monocled military men, the epitome of the cartoon Prussian officers, whom the pro-Ally press... Excuse me a second. Got a really tickly cough there. Okay. Whom the pro-Ally press liked to depict as approving the rape of Belgian nuns or using children for bayonet practice. Yeah, so this children for bayonet practice thing, this is a classic bit of World War I propaganda, which was just cooked up and made up, basically, and didn't have any factual basis to it. It wasn't occurring, but it was hand-drawn, cartoons, basically. These cartoons were made of Germans spearing children with their bayonets and then circulated, and that was used to kind of drum up anti-German sentiment and hatred in order to gain support for the move to go up against them in war. And so this is kind of a theme running through this book and sort of seems to be part of the effort and the event, the sinking of the Lusitania, is to drum up that anti-German sentiment, to get people really hating that people, to dehumanize that group of people, so that the allocation of resources and energy and life to fighting them would be approved and cheered and glorified and encouraged. And so that's a very important point to bear in mind. Okay, von Papen himself regarded the Americans as impossibly uncouth, motivated entirely by the profit motive, and contended that their greatest shortcoming was that it was impossible to obtain either decent service or properly decanted claret in any native American restaurant. He held the view that the average American was not long out of the trees, was wont to speculate publicly, quote, that he was unable to understand how they had made the transition from walking on 4 legs to 2, end quote, and would then offer his own answer that, quote, probably someone had indicated there was more money to be made by walking that way, end quote. He was also revolted by the public acceptance of political corruption and financial malpractice within the local political power groups, which he interpreted as, quote, a national ability to fall into decadence without the customary intervening and uplifting period of civilization. In his private letters to his wife and his published memoirs, von Papen gives a detailed account of his activities at this time, and also takes the credit for inspiring certain acts of direct sabotage, such as blowing up sections of the Canadian railway lines and, at a later date, placing time bombs aboard British merchantmen in the New York harbour. However, German archives show that these overt paramilitary acts were neither von Papen's idea nor his responsibility. They sprang from the activities of fringe immigrant Irish and German fanatics. Von Papen's methods, though they did not endear him to his superiors who tended to favour the more direct and indiscreet efforts of militant immigrants, did have both subtlety and humour. Neither characteristic endeared him to the British contingent in New York or to the American authorities. His reaction to the visits of George Booth and similar purchasing delegations was correctly to divine their requirements. These he attempted to finesse. His first move was to register an arms manufacturing company in the name of an American businessman of German sympathies and advance him the money with which to construct a vast factory. This company then ordered the requisite machine tools, presses, and other machinery required for the manufacture of munitions in such quantities that it filled the order books of most of the American machinery manufacturers for months to come. This operation caused severe delays in the meeting of British orders. The second operation was more insolent. Again, using the names of German sympathizers, von Papen formed numerous small companies which existed on paper only and which bore irreproachably English-sounding names. These companies then offered their non-existent wares to the British and succeeded in obtaining numerous contracts with, in several cases, substantial payments in advance. It was only when Morgan took over and coordinated the British purchasing efforts that his successes came to light. Two relatively minor operations of von Papen had a direct influence on the fate of the Lusitania and the political argument that followed. Firstly, in January 1915, he contracted to purchase through one of his dummy companies the entire forward capacity for almost 2 years of the special cases in which gun cotton was packed for shipment. These were the specialty of a subsidiary company of DuPont de Nemours. Von Papen took delivery and paid in advance. The suppliers had no idea that they were dealing with the Germans. Secondly, he established a network of agents who reported to him exactly what was going on in and around the Cunard dock. Sir Courtney Bennett was accurate when he stated that the Germans knew exactly what was going on, but he was looking in the wrong direction. Von Papen's main success was to infiltrate a German agent called Kurt Thummel, who on the 29th of January 1915, under the name of Charles Thorne, secured employment as a steward aboard the Cunard liner Transylvania. Oh, it's quite a curious name for a liner, Transylvania. British intelligence overseas was largely dominated by the Navy and the personality of the Director of Naval Intelligence, Captain Reginald Hall. He had taken over the position in October 1914 from Churchill's companion in the abortive midnight spy hunt at Loch Ewe, Admiral Oliver, who had been promoted to Chief of the Naval War Staff. Hall was a remarkable sailor, and his intelligence gifts were only discovered when ill health forced him to relinquish command of the battle cruiser Queen Mary and transfer to a desk job. In a hidebound age, he was unconventional to the point of eccentricity. His habit of screwing up his eyes as he talked earned him the nickname Blinker. An excellent contemporary judgment of him is to be found in the correspondence of Walter Hines Page, the American ambassador to London, who on the 17th of March 1917 wrote to President Wilson, quote, "Hall is one genius that the war has developed. Neither in fiction nor in fact can you find such a man to match him. Of the wonderful things that I know he has done, there are several that would take a volume to tell. The man is a genius, a clear case of genius. All other Secret Service men are amateurs by comparison. For Hall can look through you and see the very muscular movements of your immortal soul while he is talking to you. Such eyes the man has, my lord! I do study these men here most diligently who have this vast and appalling wardrobe. There are most uncommon creatures amongst them, men whom our grandchildren will read about in the school histories, but of them all the most extraordinary is this naval officer, of whom probably they'll never hear. He locks up certain documents, not to be opened till 20 years after this date. I've made up my mind to live 20 years more. I shall be present at the opening of that safe." End quote. The bulk of Hall's information came from an entirely unofficial censorship of the mail which he had induced the post office to set up shortly after his appointment. At that time, most Atlantic mail from Europe came through London, and Hall's initiative in censoring it led to many clues as to where Germany was arranging to purchase her war requirements. It was this flood of information which led to the increase in the stopping of neutral steamers bound for continental ports, and which indirectly led to the British strict control of neutral traffic in the North Sea. Hall's intelligence had meant far too large a search load for an already grievously stretched navy to achieve while at sea. Hall's second piece of luck was the wireless intercept information provided by the Marconi Company and a team of amateur British radio hams. This had been expanded by his predecessor Admiral Oliver. By December 1914, naval intelligence was intercepting almost every German signal, and a staff of experts under Sir Alfred Ewing was analysing them. A stroke of good fortune had provided the Admiralty with the official German naval codes, and by the end of February 1915 Marconi had perfected a method of radio direction finding. By the end of January 1915, Hall was able to advise the Admiralty of the departure of each U-boat as it left for patrol. As it was German practice to test their ship-to-shore radio when about 50 miles from their base, but before commencing their patrol. Okay. As it was German practice to test their ship-to-shore radio when about 50 miles from their base, but before commencing their patrol. Hull's main priority was to keep a permanent listening watch in case the German fleet put to sea, but his two personal preoccupations were the exploitation of commercial and political intelligence which he garnered from the radio and the mail, and also, since Britain owned the transatlantic and Pacific cables, from censorship of all cables. He circulated the information made available to him as he saw fit, and there is no doubt that he used it to develop a personal power base from which his activities extended far beyond those of any previous director of naval intelligence. As the war progressed, Hull became one of the most powerful men charged with the conduct of the war, and possibly, where its direction was concerned, the most powerful of all. The two main areas in which he exploited his information were the south coast of Ireland and the United States. His interest in the former lay in his determination to crush the Sinn Féin movement. It was Hull's information that led to the capture of Sir Roger Casement, and it was Hull who leaked the existence of the notorious Casement diaries to the press in order to stifle sympathy for the condemned man and to destroy any chances of his appeal then pending. The United States, however, was his main operational area, and to facilitate his aims he went to extraordinary lengths to achieve an accurate picture of what was going on there. In London, for example, a cipher clerk of the United States Embassy was an Englishman on Hull's payroll, and every message between the State Department and its European embassies was deciphered and read by naval intelligence probably before it reached its recipient. This accurate background material proved invaluable to Hull's deputy in America, Captain Gaunt. The British intelligence operation in America was divided into two sections. The gathering of military and commercial intelligence was the work of the embassy attachés, dominated by Gaunt. Civilian counterintelligence, which included the screening of passengers wishing to travel to Europe, was controlled by Sir Courtney Bennett. Both men were the opposite to their German counterparts. Both were gregarious, and Gaunt obviously liked the Americans, who in return thought the world of him. His views and his interpretations of American policy were widely sought, and because he was astonishingly well briefed, he acquired a reputation as a man who was both wise to and understanding of the American point of view. He was especially intimate with Councillor Lansing, and the two men liked nothing more than to take a leisurely Saturday lunch together and thence to go off together to a football game. He also fascinated Lansing's two nephews, Alan and J. Foster Dulles, and was probably the inspiration of the former's lifelong interest in security work, as possibly Councillor Lansing's taste for power and brinksmanship was to the latter. Through Lansing, Gaunt met many of the members of the American security services and became a close friend of Special Agent Bruce Bielaski, the senior operative of the Department of Justice. It was to prove an opportune and profitable relationship. Like von Papen, Gaunt established a comprehensive network of informants. Many of these were drawn from Englishmen resident in the United States, notably from the members of an organization called the League of Patriotic Britons Overseas. However, he spread his net wider than this small cross-section, and one of his recruits who is relevant to the story was a nervous and emotional little Hungarian-born chemist, Dr. E. W. Ritter von Rettig, who, by the outbreak of the war, had become an American citizen. A well-known expert on explosives, he had invented and patented a process for making liquid petroleum from natural gas, and because of his birth, the Austro-Hungarian embassy had asked him to work for them. Gaunt had made a similar approach and persuaded von Rettig to accept the Austro-Hungarian offer, but at the same time to accept a modest retainer for technical advice on subjects which did not conflict with his other employment. Gaunt paid him by cheque, and rapidly established the standard espionage convention of a blackmail hold over his double agent. I just noticed a mosquito flying past. Gaunt reported directly to the Admiralty. Sir Courtney's reports were channeled through the Foreign Office. The two men's duties naturally overlapped in many respects, but in one area this overlap mattered. The Admiralty's confidential instructions to the masters of merchant ships were formulated by the Trade Division of the Admiralty under Captain Richard Webb. The instructions were then submitted to the intelligence and operations staffs, and once cleared were dispatched to officers in every port, known as senior naval officers, to brief each departing captain on his route, speed, etc., together with up-to-the-minute information on U-boat activity and details of the wireless call signs and codes in force for that voyage. There was, of course, no SNO in any neutral port. So in New York, Sir Courtney was given this function. The system could and did lead to confusion. Sir Courtney would brief the outgoing captain, who was forbidden to depart from his instructions. However, Captain Gaunt had to advise the Admiralty as to the date and place of arrival of each ship and the details of their cargoes so that suitable escorts or unloading facilities could be arranged. Bennett was based on New York, Gaunt on Washington. Over 1,100 ships a month were clearing from North American ports for Britain, and unless Gaunt was immediately told the speed and destination of each ship, there was frequently too little time to inform the Admiralty in time for them to arrange an escort, and for that escort to steam to the rendezvous. On the 20th of May 1915, when the Admiralty conducted their own secret inquiry into the Lusitania disaster, Vice Admiral Oliver, Chief of the Naval War Staff, pinpointed the problem. Quote, "It happens sometimes that large numbers of Canadian troops come in ordinary passenger ships, or that valuable heavy guns or mountings come in merchant ships and have to be met and escorted. It also frequently happens that the ship has sailed before it is known, at the Admiralty, that troops or valuable government warlike stores are on board." Apart from the admission that ordinary passenger steamers were being simultaneously employed as troop ships, a fact which successive Admiralty spokesmen have categorically denied for 57 years, it is obvious that the arrangements for escorts were not as efficient as they should have been. The other contributory reason for this was that the Admiralty still believed that in order to operate in the waters off the south coast of Ireland, U-boats had to force a passage through the heavily mined. OBS has just disconnected, and it's reconnected. On the 30th of January 1915, the U-21 appeared off Liverpool and in one afternoon sank 3 unarmed merchant ships. No lives were lost, as in each case the U-21 followed the cruiser rules. She surfaced, challenged the ships, gave the crew ample time to take to their boats, and then destroyed her captives by placing bombs on board. On board her first victim, the 3,000-ton Ben Cruachan of the Ben Line in Edinburgh, she captured a complete set of Churchill's inflammatory orders, including the instructions to ram and to fly a neutral flag. Yeah, so these inflammatory orders, these were in an earlier chapter, and this was about how the British ships and the Allied ships were told to either, if they see a U-boat, either attack straight away or ram them. And it mentioned, this is a pretty good paragraph actually, because it mentioned the cruiser rules here. Cruiser rules, and this was the sort of unspoken rules of war to make it a little more civilized and minimize the amount of death and the casualties. But Churchill had basically ordered all the Allied ships to ignore these long established and observed cruiser rules, and part of the reason was because there had been no U-boats or submarines to think about or consider before, and so but it's interesting that these inflammatory orders, and I did a whole rant about order followers and people who follow orders, and how the Nuremberg trials decided that just following orders is not a acceptable defense. So I like this phrase, inflammatory orders. It's good that he's stuck with that and he's using it again. I'm just going to have a quick swig. Excuse me a moment. You know when you see a mosquito flying around and then all your legs and arms itch everywhere? I'm sure I'm getting bitten under the desk here, but doesn't matter. We got to read this book and find out what's going on. Okay, continuing. The Admiralty reacted speedily. They anticipated that the U-21 would return the way they believed she had come down through the Irish Sea, around Land's End and thence home via the Channel. Admiral Oliver immediately sent an urgent cipher signal to the naval base at Queenstown, which said, quote, "The Cunard steamers Transylvania due off Fastnet Sunday night, January the 31st, and Ausonia due off Fastnet Wednesday night, February the 3rd, both having valuable cargo, are to be ordered into Queenstown and berthed safe from submarine attack. Both ships have MV code. End quote. Written across the signal in Admiral Oliver's handwriting is the notation, quote, deflected into Queenstown on account of a 70-ton gun on board for RN, end quote. So it's kind of establishing precedent, saying that other ships were being used to transport munitions, other ships which were sort of ostensibly passenger ships, cargo ships, were actually being used to move munitions and guns. The background to this is both curious and illuminating. The guns were two of a series of 4 pairs of 14-inch guns, complete with turrets, which the Bethlehem Steel Company had been constructing for the Greek battleship Salamis. Churchill heard about them and persuaded Mr. Schwab, the president of Bethlehem Steel, to sell them to the Royal Navy. Equally curious but not unexpected, neither ship's clearance nor supplementary manifests handed in at New York mention them, which is indicative of either the inefficiency or the pro-British sympathies of the neutrality officials inspecting all outgoing steamers, and the attitude of Collector of Customs Malone. In each case, the turrets with their guns mounted were carried on the Cunarder's foredecks. In each case, the turrets with their guns mounted were carried on the Cunarder's foredecks. Both liners were duly warned by Queenstown, and as soon as they docked, all passengers were held incommunicado. The scare lasted 2 days, and 4 indignant American passengers' complaints eventually percolated back to the State Department. All 4 complaints specifically mention the guns, but though each one is initialed by Councillor Lansing, they do not appear to have been forwarded to either the Secretary of State or the neutrality officials of New York Harbor. Behind the 2 Cunarders, which had been diverted into Queenstown, was a steady procession of cargo and passenger ships, each bringing its complement of supplies and each following the same track, aiming to make its landfall at the Fastnet Rock before discharging at either Avonmouth or Liverpool. The commander of the U-21 reported to the German Admiralty, quote, having only 1 torpedo left for the return voyage, I was forced to decide not to mount a surface attack on 41 merchant vessels which I was able to ascertain from my annuals were armed. End quote. The annuals referred to were 2 British publications, Jane's Fighting Ships 1914 and the Naval Annual 1914. Both publications were standard issue to each U-boat. One ship which escaped thanks to the U-21's reluctance was the Lusitania, which cleared the Fastnet at dawn on the 5th of January. Both British naval publications listed her as armed, Jane's as an auxiliary cruiser, the Naval Annual as an armed merchantman. Okay, so there you have two primary source documents listing the Lusitania itself as an armed ship. Back to the text. On this voyage, as before, she was commanded by Captain Fairweather Dow, and amongst the passengers was Colonel Edward House of Houston, Texas. Colonel Edward House. Now, worth pausing a moment there and telling people who maybe didn't catch the last live stream that at the beginning of that I read from a blog post that I found which talked about Colonel House's relationship with, was it the president? And the president at the time, and he was an incredibly interesting man and seemed to be a sort of offstage shadow, what would you say, shadow government figure. You know, he wasn't officially holding a position of power, but he held an immense amount of sway and seemed to be running the show, but offstage, behind the scenes, if you catch my drift. So interesting that he was on the ship at this time. House was the personal representative and confidential advisor of President Wilson. So there you go, that president. His mission was a secret, for he brought with him the president's proposals for a peace initiative that he was to place in turn before the Allies and the Kaiser. His diary of his visit to Europe survives in the archives of Yale University. Quote, February the 5th. The first 2 days we had summer seas, but just after passing the banks a gale came shrieking down. It lasted for 24 hours, and the Lusitania, big as she is, tossed about like a cork in the rapids. The This afternoon, as we approached the Irish coast, the American flag was raised. It created such excitement, and comment and speculation ranged in every direction. February the 6th. I found from Mr. Beresford, Lord D.C.'s brother, who crossed with us, that Captain Dow had been greatly alarmed the night before and had asked him, Beresford, to remain with him on the bridge all night. He expected to be torpedoed, and that was the reason for raising the American flag. I can see many. So this is a ship built in Liverpool, um, flying the American flag, and this is partly because of, well, I think probably entirely because of Churchill's plan that if he could get the Germans or the Americans to think that Germany had attacked them, it would be much more likely that they would join the war and help kick the Germans' heads in. And so they had I think there was a directive sent out which required all neutral ships, passenger ships, merchant ships to fly the American flag for this reason. Although probably they didn't know that that was a reason. But interesting here that the captain was expecting to be torpedoed. Back to the quote. I can see many possible complications arising from this incident. Every newspaper in London has asked me about it, but fortunately I was not an eyewitness to it and have been able to say that I only knew it from hearsay. The alarm of the captain for the safety of his boat caused him to map out a complete program for the saving of passengers, the launching of lifeboats, etc. He told Beresford that if the boilers were not struck by the torpedoes, the boat could remain afloat for at least an hour, and in that time he would endeavour to save the passengers. End quote. Captain Dow, it would seem, did not share the views of the owners, designer and builders of the Lusitania, and was only too aware of the vulnerability of the longitudinal bulkheads. He had yet, however, even to sight a submarine, and no ship of any character had ever challenged him. So far, no merchant ship had been attacked without warning, but several submarines had narrowly escaped disaster from attempts to ram, and feelings amongst the U-boat commanders were running hot. In Germany, the effects of the British blockade were beginning to be felt, and rationing of cereals, milk and flour had been introduced the previous week. The formal British declaration of the North Sea as a prohibited area was the final signal to the Germans that they must speedily introduce such countermeasures as would relieve a situation which threatened to undermine the economic structure of the country, and through this collapse lead to military defeat. It was exactly the result the British war plans had envisaged, but these plans had not envisaged the submarine. Lord Fisher had done so, but as has already been explained, his views had been spurned. Now, sitting in the First Sea Lord's office in Whitehall, he anticipated the German solution and recorded it for his memoirs. Quote, if dear old Tirpitz is only far-seeing enough, those damned Germans will multiply means of dishing the blockade by making the life of surface ships a burden to them by submarines. End quote. As usual, he was proved to be correct. He was to be proved correct. I'm doing that thing where I'm reading the correct words, but in the wrong order. Maybe this is too late for me to be streaming. Okay, how's it going? Good to see Frank Lennon in the chat saying you missed the start again, so you're going to catch it on the replay. No problem. But you dropped in at the mention of Mandel House, saying someone of inordinate influence in presidential circles in the US. Yeah, that's exactly right, Frank. Colonel Edward Mandel House, one of these people who had just an inexplicable amount of influence, kind of somebody who was in these circles and relied upon and consulted and talked to, and wasn't democratically elected, wasn't put there through any sort of the usual avenues of voting and of kind of competing and getting and working your way to the top or anything like that. And so very interesting figure to look into. I know Richard Grove has done a decent amount of work looking at the primary source documents, his diaries and his memoirs and these kind of books. So interesting that he shows up, and also quite fascinating that we've got that sort of not, was it an uncle or a mentor of one of the Dulles brothers? So we've got that legacy and that lineage, because a lot of the times it's very good to see how these people sort of, when they train up their future proteges, and so quite interesting that the name Schwab popped up here in that chapter, because we're currently dealing with a Schwab on the world stage who's trying to roll out some insane plans, and he has a, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the current Schwab, Klaus, wasn't he trained and mentored by Kissinger? Um, I think I'm getting that right. And so learning about who these people were continuing the work of is also important. They don't just appear sort of in isolation, unconnected, and so this is why we've got to kind of try and map these networks out. And then old books like this are very revealing because suddenly we learn about somebody who was influencing the young Dulles brothers. And so when we want to at some point on this channel we might get around to learning about the CIA, maybe reading some of the David Talbot books, because I know he's done some work. I think it's The Devil's Chessboard, which is a big ridiculous thick book that'll take that'll take months to get through. But I know that is all about the Dulles brothers, and knowing who trained them and who inspired them and who passed on their knowledge and kind of skills is very critical to understanding the flow of history and why we are where we are today, and how that the situations that we're facing today kind of came about. And so I think one of the really valuable things that we're learning from this book is that accidents do happen. Accidents are allowed to happen. Accidents are told or are described to us as though they're accidents, but actually they're not accidents. If that makes sense. That didn't make sense, right? Let me phrase it another way. There's kind of two views of history, right? There's the sort of accidental things just happened randomly, and none of it was planned, and it was all just and then this event happened, and then that event happened, and now here we are. How about that? That's one view of history, the sort of chaotic, random, accidental view of history. But then there's the more nuanced and detailed and high resolution view of history, which shows that many of these kind of events, which are described to our to our children, to our youth as being accidental, or being one group's desire to hurt another group. Actually, when you dive into and do these and read these kinds of deep dives, you find out that actually there was a lot more to the story. These events were planned in many cases, or they were allowed to happen, or the bad guys were trained and funded by the good guy. The bad guys were trained and funded by the good guys, and actually both sides have the same. Both branches, the good guys and the bad guys, actually have the same rotten root. It's kind of like the metaphor I always use about the left wing and the right wing, it being that they're both wings of the same bird of prey, which is intent on, pecking your eyeballs out. Speaking of eyeballs, hasn't Apple released a new Vision goggle VR experience device? Which I saw a headline today saying that there's a study suggesting that this device rewires the circuitry of the brain. So that's good. But we've got Heidi in the chat. Good evening, Heidi. And Dr. Crispy, hello. I saw you last night over on Baron Strawberry's live stream. Good to have you here. Heidi says orchestrated accidents. Yes, that's it. That's what I'm going for. So accidents do happen, and we're like, oh, isn't that just an accident? Nobody could have. It's like, it's like the big 11th of September event. No one could have predicted this ever happening. No, well, despite the fact that the military had been training for this very scenario on the day that it happened. And then also, most recently, the October 7th event. Nobody could have ever predicted that this event, an attack, was going to take place. Well, apart from the fact that residents who lived there and Secret Service and analysts were all telling, the Israeli government that an attack was imminent and something like this would happen. So, yeah, all the world's a stage. I think you say that very well, Heidi, and I agree with you completely. And that's kind of provable when we dive into the books and we read about these events and learn about how they really happened. So, that is chapter 5. Let's crack on with chapter 6. So yeah, we've got some pretty big names here. Colonel House, the Dulles brothers, Lord Fisher, as I mentioned, played a big role in bringing us to getting World War One started. Lord Fisher had a role in that. But let's go back to the book cam and crack on chapter 6. One second before we get into that, I'll just have a quick sip. Cool. So I think we've got a better connection tonight, and my audio is not dropping out quite as often, although it does seem to drop out occasionally, so I apologize for that. Hopefully it's 95 or 98% clear and uninterrupted. So this is chapter 6. The British proclamation of the North Sea as a war zone in November 1914, and the realization by the operational officers of the German Navy that not only were a great many Allied merchant ships armed, but that all had instructions to disregard the cruiser rules and immediately to attack any submarine, sparked an immediate backlash. The German officers prepared a memorandum addressed to the Chief of Naval Staff, Vice Admiral von Pohl, urging that U-boats should also abandon the cruiser rules and attack all Allied merchantmen without warning. Neutral ships, they suggested, should be warned not to sail into British ports unless they had previously furnished the German Admiralty through consular channels with a description both of the ship and of its cargo, which must not be war material. Their proposal was, in fact, a counter-blockade. Von Pohl liked their argument and put it before the German War Staff, where Admiral von Tirpitz opposed it. And didn't it mention actually in an earlier chapter that Tirpitz, this admiral of the German naval powers, was in contact with the admiral of the British naval powers? I think that was right at the end of the introduction. Just want to check that quickly. Yeah, okay. So just a quick flashback to the introduction in case you missed that video. Obviously, it's the first one on the playlist. But Lord Fisher and Tirpitz were in communication with each other. And this is the way it is in many cases. I often think of like politics and world events as like the best analogy is WWF. Not that I watch that, but it's all bravado and threats and fighting and smashing chairs over each other's head and cage fights, on the stage. But then off stage, they're going for beers and having steaks and their friends and their buddies and pals, and they're discussing what's going to happen next in the soap opera that is this kind of events. And so that was quite a revealing quote right at the end of the introduction there. Lord Fisher writes to Tirpitz, "I don't blame you for the submarine business. I'd have done exactly the same as you." Anyway, back to chapter 6. He had doubts, this is von Tirpitz, he had doubts about the international legality of a submarine blockade and foresaw trouble with neutrals. The increasing use by the British of neutral flags was bound to lead to mistakes. So this is looking more like the British, this is what they were hoping would happen, right? Issuing the orders that you have to attack the submarines on sight and also forcing them to all fly the American flag. They're confusing. They're abandoning the established rules and the established behaviors and the established practices. They're sowing confusion. They're increasing the likelihood of of Germany taking the bait and attacking a ship that flies an American flag. So I don't think it even mattered that I'm trying to catch this mosquito. I don't think it even mattered whether or not it was a really, actually an American ship. It just had to sort of be flying the flag and have the appearance of one to get America sort of riled up and involved. So Britain definitely had a huge part to play in my-hopping this, which is make it happen on purpose, my-hopping this whole situation. Von Pohl agreed to drop the word blockade and suggested the retaliatory measure of declaring the waters off the British and Irish coasts a war zone. Von Tirpitz replied, quote, "This is more far-reaching in its effect on materials than a regular blockade, and is thus considerably more dangerous politically. The reference to the measures taken by the English in designating the North Sea as dangerous does not seem to be apt." End quote. He went on to explain that the British justification for their war zone had been the allegation that the Germans had laid mines there. I just turned 2 pages. An allegation which he said was false, as the only German mines laid had been offensive fields limited to the approaches to East Coast ports. At this point, the German Foreign Office entered the argument, stating that they preferred the idea of a war zone, as declaration of a blockade would weaken their own protests that total blockade was illegal. German public and press opinion was also demanded retaliation against the British measures, and the announcement of a war zone operative from 18th February was formally made by the Kaiser on the 5th of February 1915. The same day he addressed the U-boat commanders at Wilhelmshaven. Towards the end of his speech he mentioned that by sinking enemy merchant ships without warning there would be undoubted loss of life amongst the crews. At this point he paused and then said, quote, "If it is possible for you to save the crews of the merchant ships, do it." End quote. After a further pause, he added, quote, "If you cannot save them, then it cannot be helped." End quote. Some U-boat commanders went off on patrol, but on 15th of February, oh, that's tomorrow. I thought it was today. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody, by the way. But on 15th of February, the Kaiser had second thoughts, for he telegraphed every U-boat commander at sea, ordering them, quote, "on no account to attack ships flying neutral flags unless they were recognized with positive certainty as being enemy ships in disguise," end quote. Okay, so the Kaiser's sort of wise to this trap that's being laid, and I think he's kind of doing what he can to avoid falling into it and setting off the trap. The Kaiser's telegram was motivated by the reaction of the United States. The German proclamation of a war zone, together with an accompanying memorial of explanation, was presented to the State Department on the 5th of February by the German ambassador, Count Bernstorff. Secretary Bryan was away in the West on a speaking trip, and the German note was received in his absence by Councillor Lansing. The text of the note is important. Quote, "The waters surrounding Great Britain and Ireland, including the whole English Channel, to be a war zone. On and after the 18th of February 1915, every enemy merchant ship found in the said war zone will be destroyed, without it being always possible to avert the dangers threatening the crews and passengers on that account. Even neutral ships are exposed to dangers in the war zone, as in view of the misuse of neutral flags ordered on January the 31st by the British government, and of the accidents of naval war, mistakes will not always be avoided, and they may be struck by attacks directed at enemy ships." The proclamation went on to list safe zones in which neutral ships could travel without danger, though none of these zones led to an English port. The memorial which accompanied the proclamation went into an elaborate justification of the German decision. It stressed that the British had been the first to declare such a war zone, and finished by asking the United States and all neutral powers to take such steps as they thought necessary to warn their nationals not to sail as passengers or to entrust their cargoes to enemy ships. Lansing read the proclamation at first without consulting the memorial, and the same day, in Bryan's absence, he drafted a note of protest to Germany, which he submitted to the President at 7 p.m. the same evening. It was a menacing and belligerent epistle describing the proclamation as a wanton act unparalleled in naval warfare. However, after reading the memorial and conferring with the solicitors to the State Department, he submitted a further memorandum 2 days later stating that the advisability of any protest at all was open to question. By February, Lansing's belligerency had returned, and he produced a draft note which the President accepted. This draft entirely ignored the suggestion that the American government should warn Americans not to seek passage on Allied ships, and Bryan, now returned, protested angrily at this omission to the President, who countered by asking Lansing to prepare him a brief as to the precise legal situation regarding passengers on belligerent merchant ships, with particular reference to cases where such merchant ships were armed. It was at this juncture that Lansing committed the United States to the path that was to lead to war. So the President is asking Lansing about the exact legal situation that is going to become relevant once the Lusitania is attacked and sunk. So incredible prescient foreknowledge there. The outstanding case law on the subject is contained in the judgment of an action called the Nereid case, in which Chief Justice Marshall of the Supreme Court had opined that an armed merchant ship is an open and declared belligerent, claiming all the rights and subject to all the dangers of the belligerent character. The Nereid was a British merchant vessel which was captured by the American privateer, the Governor Tompkins, on the 19th of December 1813. Ship and cargo were confiscated by the American authorities in the United States' role as an ally of France. A Spanish passenger, Manuel Pinto, owned part of its cargo. He claimed it back on the grounds that he was a neutral and did not know the Nereid was armed or that she had orders to resist attack. He lost his case. The appeal went to the Supreme Court on the 6th of March, 1815. Lansing, a distinguished lawyer, quoted several of the arguments from the Nereid case in support of his views. These so impressed the president that later, when Congress was attacking him for appearing to drag the United States into the war, he asked Lansing to enlarge on his summary of the Nereid precedent for the benefit of those congressmen who were to speak on behalf of the administration. On both occasions, Lansing omitted the vital sentence of the judgment quoted above. At this remove, the only charitable explanation is that Lansing's opinion to both President and Congress was bad in law. But there is some justification for thinking it may have been a deliberate omission. 21 years later, a Senate Committee on Foreign Relations examined the matter. Evidence was given that, quote, of Marshall's opinion a garbled version was got out, a version so false as to constitute practically a forgery, but it was widely disseminated, and it was used in speeches even in Congress. Bad law, or bad faith, Lansing's opinions were accepted by the president, and diplomatic honor was outwardly maintained by sending simultaneously with the note to Germany a sharp note to Great Britain complaining of the use of the American flag and trusting that, quote, no explicit sanction, let's try that again. No explicit sanction had been given to this procedure by either the British Admiralty or the Foreign Office. Unfortunately, President Wilson sent a private telegram to Colonel House, then in London, which, quote, regretted the necessity of sending the note, but sooner or later it could not be avoided, end quote. The telegram, of course, was deciphered and read before House even received it, and the British Foreign Office blandly replied to the American government, quote, the German proclamation of February the 5th of sinking British merchantmen at sight without giving any opportunity of making any provision for saving the lives of non-combatants, crews and passengers had led to the master of the Lusitania hoisting the American flag as a defense measure, and it had only been hoisted at the request of American passengers in order to ensure their safety. The note went on to confirm that neither the government nor the Admiralty had sanctioned such action. This was the diplomatic lie direct, and Lansing must have known it, as the German memorial had enclosed photographs of the Admiralty instructions they had captured. He had ignored them and had not mentioned them to either Bryan or the President. The American note to Germany possessed what Lord Morley, a former cabinet minister and close friend of Churchill, described at the time as an air of senseless animosity. After first condemning any departure from the cruiser rules as unprecedented in naval warfare, it carried the ultimate threat that was to bring the United States into the war. Quote, in the event that German submarines should destroy on the high seas an American vessel or the lives of American citizens, it would be difficult for the government of the United States to view the action in any other light than as an indefensible violation of neutral rights. End quote. It added that if such a situation should arise, the German government would be held to a strict accountability. The view that the presence of any American citizen on any Allied ship, even if that ship was an armed munitions carrier, was in fact a warning to Germany that she attacked it at the risk of war with the United States, astounded the Germans as much as it delighted the British. The German government began to backpedal. Germany promptly offered to drop the offending instructions to her submarines and to observe the standard cruise rules, provided in return that England would permit foodstuffs to enter Germany and cease arming merchant ships. I think that seems like a fair trade, doesn't it? Seems fair enough. Let us eat food and stop arming neutral merchant ships, and we won't kill any Americans. She also suggested that if the United States would inform her of any American vessels into English ports, together with their routes and destinations, and preferably if she would arrange to paint the stars and stripes on the ship's sides, she would guarantee their immunity from attack. These concessions made sense to President Wilson, But from England, the American ambassador reported that there was not, quote, a ray of hope of any agreement between Germany and England, whereby England will permit food to enter Germany under any condition, end quote. And that's footnote 12. I want to find out where that came from. So, what are we? Chapter 6 and 14. And that's from the Times. Oh, sorry, it wasn't 14, was it? It was 12. Foreign Relations Supplement. Ambassador page to Brian, 20th February 1915. Interesting. Yeah, so it's kind of you can see that Britain wanted things to happen this way. It was really all England's doing. That's what it's looking like to me. Churchill's policy of arming merchant ships and ordering them to ignore cruiser rules had been designed to embroil Germany with neutral powers. Now it was so obviously doing so, he was not prepared to abandon it. Germany's protests at Britain's arming of merchant ships had also received cavalier treatment from Lansing, who had tacitly allowed them to use American ports. He had stipulated that while in port, their armament must not be mounted, and without consultation with Bryan, came to an informal understanding with the British Embassy that they would inform him which ships did carry guns. Of the known 1,319 armed ships in the merchant marine which frequently used American ports from September 1914 until the United States' entry into the war, the State Department was informed of only 17. One case came to the notice of Secretary Bryan, and it is indicative as to how seriously Britain took America's reservations. On the 1st September 1914, the steamer Marion entered New York displaying an armament of 6 6-inch guns. The German embassy informed the State Department. Bryan approached the British ambassador, who gave an assurance that the armament would be dismounted immediately. 3 days later, the British embassy asked the State Department if there would be any objection in the dismounted guns were subsequently shipped to Britain as cargo on another ship, since guns as cargo were against the US law. Bryan's reply speaks for itself. Quote, replying to your note of September the 4th, it seems unnecessary to answer the query as to the shipment of the Marion's guns to England as cargo in another vessel, for the reason that the department is informed that notwithstanding the assurances of your government, the Marion sailed with her guns and ammunition. End quote. At the British ambassador's request, the last sentence was withdrawn from the official record by Lansing, as it reflected on the honour of the British government. Nor did Lansing pass the correspondence to the archives, but retained it amongst his own papers. Cheeky Lansing. The arming of merchant ships had been only one of Britain's attempts to prepare for a submarine offensive, for the German announcement of a blockade had been long expected and in some Admiralty quarters accepted as legal. This acceptance had surfaced publicly in the Times on the 16th of July 1914, when Admiral Sir Percy Scott wrote with reference to the anticipated proclamation of a war zone. Quote, such a proclamation would, in my opinion, be perfectly in order, and once it had been made, if any British or neutral ships disregarded it, they could not be held to be engaged in peaceful avocations, and if they were sunk in the attempt, it could not be described as a relapse into savagery or piracy in its blackest form. Look up the accounts of what happened to blockade runners into Charleston during the Civil War in America. The blockading cruisers seldom had any scruples about firing into the vessels they were chasing. The submarine torpedo will be a newer deterrent. Sir Percy's opinions were shared by the Chief of Staff of the French Mediterranean Fleet, who expressed his opinion that submarine warfare, as announced by the Germans, was justified. News of the dialogue within the German Navy and of the pressure for a submarine blockade had reached the Admiralty by mid-November. There is evidence from Commander J.M. Kenworthy, a member of Naval Intelligence Staff, political section, that it was actually hoped for at the time that Britain made her declaration about the North Sea. Okay, I'll get that up because I'm turning the page. There is evidence from Commander J.M. Kenworthy, a member of Naval Intelligence Staff political section, that it was actually hoped for at the time that Britain made her declaration about the North Sea. The defensive measures to counter such a threat had been finalised by early December 1914. The waters around the coasts of England and Ireland were divided into 23 areas, each patrolled by a new force called an auxiliary patrol. These units incorporated the coastal motorboat operation commanded by Admiral Sir Frederick Inglefield, but not his seagulls. Each area was designated with a number. The south coast of Ireland was Area 21 under the overall command of Vice Admiral Sir Charles Coke, whose headquarters were at Queenstown, Cork. His defences consisted of 4 torpedo boats and 4 small units of the new auxiliary patrol, each containing 1 armed yacht, 4 motor fishing boats, and 1 motorboat. Their task was to provide effective submarine protection for 285 miles of coastline. Under Standing Admiralty Instructions of 1910, the torpedo boats' duties were to be confined to sweeping the approaches to Queenstown Harbour, and these had never been altered. This left the auxiliary patrol to carry the entire defensive burden. Between them, they had 5 wireless sets and a motley collection of armament, the heaviest caliber weapon being a 12-pounder mounted on the yacht Skadown. By the middle of April 1915, wear and tear had reduced the strength of the auxiliary patrol to a total of 17 small vessels, and allowing for rest and maintenance, it was impractical to have more than 11 at sea at the time. The fastest ship was capable of making 11 knots, and the patrol area of each ship encompassed 300 square miles. This absurdly small force was the main protection for the area, which was Britain's most vital supply route, and the focal point for all shipping heading for the British Isles from North America. Sounds a bit like that area of fence that Hamas broke into on October the 7th. Further out in the Atlantic off the Irish coast was a patrol cruiser from No. 11 Cruiser Squadron, known as E for signal purposes, also based on Queenstown. These were old ships of 5,600 tons, carrying 11 6-inch guns, a slightly smaller armament than that which the Lusitania had been designed to carry. Their age and the fact that they belonged to the class of cruiser with unarmoured longitudinal bulkheads, not to be exposed to submarine attack, meant that they were of dubious value. The only useful ships in the western area were a flotilla of 5 destroyers based on Milford Haven some 300 miles away. These were kept exclusively for escort duty to ships carrying valuable cargo. Probably, the higher-ups, the Churchills and the Lord Fishers and these kind of people. I bet that's the valuable cargo that they were reserved for protecting. The German submarine offensive was to be mounted by a total fleet of only 21 submarines, but maintenance and repairs meant that in practice never more than 7 could be at sea, and in the waters around the Irish coast and the English west coast ports, there were rarely more than 2 U-boats present at any one time. However, it was in these areas that 80% of the effects of the German proclamation was felt. From February, when the German war zone came into force, until the 28th of March 1915, 25 merchant ships were sunk by German submarines. 16 of these were torpedoed without warning, and from these 16, 52 crew members out of a total of 712 were killed. 38 of this total were lost when the Tangistan, loaded with nitrates, blew up off Flamborough Head. On the 25 ships sunk, there were 3,072 passengers, and not one of these lost their lives. Wow, that's incredible. 20 of the 25 ships sunk suffered no loss of life whatsoever. That's incredible. On the 28th of March, this not altogether discreditable record in what history has designated total warfare was blotted. 38 miles west of the Smalls Lighthouse and shortly after 38 miles west of the Smalls Lighthouse and shortly after 2 p.m., the U-28 ordered the 5,000-ton cargo and passenger line Falaba to halt by firing a shot across her bows. The Falaba refused. Eventually, the U-28 forced her to a halt and gave her master 10 minutes to abandon ship. The Falaba continued to send out wireless messages for assistance, and as disembarkation was still in progress, the U-28 extended the period by another 10 minutes. A third extension of 3 minutes was granted, and shortly after this, an armed British trawler came to the scene. The U-28 promptly put a torpedo into the stern of the Falaba, and her cargo, which included 13 tons of high explosive, exploded. Amongst the casualties was an American citizen, Leon C. Thresher. The fury with which the American press reacted was to bind the president politically even closer to his acceptance of Lansing's doctrine of strict accountability. At the time, the public version of events was that little or no warning had been given, that the torpedoing had been a cold-blooded and wanton act of destruction. The true nature of the cargo was vigorously denied. The manifest and the statements of the ship's officers were not released in full until 1965. What's that, 50 years later? The inevitable showdown with Germany was delayed because the battle of ideals between Lansing and Bryan was now in full swing. That's a really important paragraph right there because, he talks about the public version of events. So this is what you get in your mainstream, in your blue check mark algorithm promoted YouTube accounts and Twitter accounts and whatever social media sort of accounts you get in the mainstream newspapers, on your BBC. It's the public version of events, and that is a carefully edited and highly sanitized and scripted version of what is actually going on in almost all cases. I can't really I've not really paid any attention to mainstream media for so long now that when I accidentally do, it makes me feel kind of dirty and a bit like, ugh. um, for that reason, because I just know that I'm getting a public version of things, and I'm not getting the real version of what went on. And we might never get the real version of a lot of these things, but we can certainly get a better version, a more accurate and realistic and believable version from people like Colin Simpson, who write books of this nature for us to read, much better than what we get in the mainstream. And my kind of a big takeaway that I'm getting from this book is that if they did it back then, if they lied to the public back then and locked away the relevant documents that told the truth for 50 years, until the people who could be prosecuted are dead, basically. If they did it back then, they'll be doing it again. They'll be doing it today, because not that much has changed, really. It's just the technology that we have in our pockets and access to has changed. But other than that, the sort of control systems, the people in charge, the people who are trying to run things and really nail down every aspect of freedom for the majority of people that they possibly can across the world, they're still running the same scams and games that they always have been, and it was proven that they lied back then. It increases the likelihood that they're lying now, because there is a kind of there's a precedent set, right? So that's why I think it's really important to read these kind of books and get a good grasp on history and what actually happened. So a little rant over there. We'll carry on. Yeah, so they denied the true nature of the cargo, locked up the manifest and the statements of the ship's officers for 50 years. The inevitable showdown with Germany was delayed because the battle of ideals between Lansing and Bryan was now in full swing. Lansing insisted that Germany wanted war with the United States and that a hard line should be taken. Bryan diligently acquired a reasonably accurate account of the Falaba story from the American consul in Plymouth, who had interviewed several survivors. At last the president appeared to favor Bryan's viewpoint and admitted that perhaps a hard line was the wrong course, and wrote to him that, quote, perhaps it is not necessary to make formal representations in the matter at all, end quote. The president was still in this indecisive mood a month later. Both the German community in New York and the foreign ministry in Berlin could see the writing on the wall. Should there be any further escalation of the crisis, there was little doubt that the United States would embark upon a European war on the side of the Allies. The Berlin view was that it would make very little difference, as to all intents and purposes America was already so industrially and financially committed to the Allies, and this opinion was shared by many Americans of importance. Colonel House reported from London that, quote, the sooner America entered the war the better, end quote, as he felt that the Allies found America's peace proposals futile and possibly offensive. He advised the president to take a sharp line with Germany and darkly hinted, quote, a more serious breach may at any time occur. So this little these quotes here and this focus on Colonel House reminds me of J.P. Morgan and his appearance in the story in chapter 2 or 3, who basically said he supported the Allies, and he thought that America should also come into the war on the side of the Allies, and that he would sort of maneuver and create the necessary fake companies and shell companies that would allow the transportation of munitions in these passenger liners, in the Cunard liners. So you've got these figures like Colonel House and figures like J.P. Morgan, these are the kind of figures who are really making the decisions about what happens. It's not the individual citizens within these democracies who vote and have control over what happens. I think most people at this time were like, no, we don't want to be in that war. Why would we want to be in a war? We got a good thing going on here in America. We got a nice bit of prosperity. We got work, jobs, cars. Things are looking up. Why would we want to go to war? It's nothing to do with us. Leave them to it. And so, but men like Colonel House and J.P. Morgan, they want more for themselves. War is profitable. They can gather more influence and power and wealth this way. They can, in the case of J.P. Morgan, make more loans, collect more interest. That's their business model. And so these are the real sort of power players whispering into the ears of the president in the case of Colonel House, and J.P. Morgan deciding to commit his resources, his energy, and his effort to the support of the Allies before the president of the country had decided to make that commitment. So the power is somewhere else. The power is not where we're told it is, right? I think that's a key takeaway as well. The possibility of a further and more serious breach was worrying the German community of New York, and on 20th of April, a group of them met to see if they could do anything to avert it. The meeting was convened by George Viereck, and editor of the German-owned American newspaper, The Fatherland, and among those present were a Dr. Bernhard Dernberg and a Dr. Karl Führer. The meeting reviewed the situation, and Viereck remarked, "Sooner or later, some big passenger boat with Americans on board will be sunk by a submarine. Then there will be hell to pay." End quote. Others present argued that they were on the wrong track. It would be better to concentrate on making Americans aware of the immorality of the British blockade and the fact that merchantmen were being instructed to disobey instructions to halt. Dr. Führer suggested that if any emotional emphasis was due, it should be given to details of the starving children of Germany. But Dr. Dernberg's counter-argument carried the meeting. Quote, "The American people cannot visualize the spectacle of 100,000, even 1,000,000 German children starving by slow degrees as a result of the British blockade. But they can visualize the pitiful face of a little child drowning amidst the wreckage caused by a German torpedo." End quote. Yeah, and that's such a powerful quote, because it really is so true. In a lot of cases, these big numbers, these large numbers, they're just kind of used to wow and bedazzle us and make us think like that the person using them knows more than we do, and has done more research and more learning and has more authority, and we have to trust them and believe in them. And he's absolutely right there, that if you want to drum up sympathy and get the whole of nation on board, then you just need to show them a small handful, one, maybe two, three, a small group, because it's more relatable. We can see that as a family, we can see that as a class full of children, we can see that as someone's daughter, someone's son. But some of these numbers, they become too abstract, and it's very hard for us to hold in our hearts the compassion and empathy necessary to account for like 100,000 lives, for example. So this is really betraying here how expert these kinds of people are in understanding the human psyche and the psychology of humans, and how that knowledge is weaponized and used to manipulate and push levers and get people to behave in ways that is counterintuitive to their true nature as compassionate, loving, caring beings who just want to live in sort of peace and harmony with the natural world and with each other, I think, in most cases. And this is just a real sort of betrayal of that dark, occulted knowledge of human psychology, and particularly the psychology of groups as well, because they know how to get a whole group to well, in this day and age, to change the banner on their profile picture to support some cause, like, oh, we're going to get everyone to change their profile picture to blue and yellow, and then boom, an event happens and everyone's got their blue and yellow filters on their profile pictures and hanging outside there. And it's like, dude, that's not even your country. If you want to use the Union Jack, I'm going to go on a little side tangent here for a second, because I'm in Vietnam, and I've observed this phenomenon. And I lived in Vietnam for 4 years. And in Vietnam, the flag is it's a red flag and it's got a five-pointed star in the middle, and the star is yellow. And it's everywhere. Everyone flies it. It's on the balconies of most of the houses. Not only that, though, when you travel around, you'll see groups of school children or groups of colleagues who work together, and they'll all have T-shirts on, red T-shirt, yellow star in the middle, and they'll wear it as a group, and they'll wear it proudly and without any level of any sense of kind of irony or shame. They're nationalistic and they're proud and they believe in their country. And there's good things and bad things about that, and certainly reasons as to why that is, which I won't go into. But what I thought about was the parallel with England, where I'm from. And if you saw a bunch of people waving the Union Jack or wearing a T-shirt with the Union Jack, it's kind of become associated with sort of right-wing, racist, beer swigging, kind of skinhead, working class idiots. It's not seen as a source of pride, something to be emotionally attached to want to contribute to want to belong to. It's got a totally different set of connotations and ideas linked to it, and yet in both cases it's just the use of a flag. And I can't imagine like a whole group of school children walking around wearing the Union Jack or the cross of St. George, or so just a very fascinating sort of comparison and juxtaposition of the use of that symbol of a flag there that I've noticed sort of on my travels. And I think it's very sort of pertinent because these kind of players, they're playing at a level where they have a very vast, deep, and expert knowledge of humans and how humans work, not only individually but also in groups. And this guy knows that if you want to get a group of people to cheer for war, then you've got to show them a small amount of dying, suffering children that they can relate to, that they can feel compassion and sympathy for, and that is way more likely to get to drum up support than just flashing a lot of large numbers in their face. That's kind of cold. It's abstract and it's hard to care about large numbers. So, we'll finish this final paragraph. Dernberg's graphic picture prompted Dr. Fuhrer to ask the date of departure of the next great English passenger liner to England. It transpired it was the Lusitania, due to sail in 10 days' time on the 1st of May. Viereck shouted, quote, "Then publish a warning before the Lusitania sails." End quote. Good stuff. That is chapter 6. How about that? For those on the live stream, what do you think? Any quotes or observations or interesting things pop out to you there? Heidi says music rewires our brains as well. Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, music's been a big part of my life growing up. Being very passionate about music and playing in bands and writing music, and it's been yeah, I wouldn't be the same person if I didn't have it. And even now to this day, I record, I play guitar and come up with little ditties, and I stick them to the beginnings and ends of some of the videos that I put here on the channel. So any guitar music you might hear on my videos, that's all original stuff that I've written and recorded on my old crappy little iPhone. But it's original, it's authentic, and that's what you get here. Well, maybe not so much originality, but you definitely get authenticity. Malcolm, you just arrived and you're going to catch up later. Great. I hope you've had a good day and you enjoy the video on the replay. I don't think I'm going to push on tonight. It's getting kind of late, and we've done 2 chapters there, but very interesting stuff. We're kind of seeing now the pieces of the puzzle sort of fall into place, and the lead up to it. So I think if I'm not mistaken, the public version of events at the time was that Germany just attacked the Lusitania out of cold blood, murdered a lot of Americans, and that was that. It was unprompted, but now we're seeing that actually they were kind of backed into a corner, or at least, if not backed into a corner, they were at least set up. They were kind of the circumstances, the way the English, the British were playing the game was so disingenuous and so kind of dishonest because they were changing the rules and giving these orders and confusing things and taking steps that had never been done before, that the Germans were kind of like, you're really setting us up to. It was like they're setting a trap. That's it. Has the feeling of setting a trap to me, and it was just kind of like, go on then, I dare you. You know, this kind of taunting, and just making it impossible for these rules to be followed for the Germans to know how to act. So I think that is that for today's stream. Um, Thank you very much for being here. I am reasonably sure we can do another one tomorrow night, but I'm not 100% sure. But I'd say I'd put it at about a 75% chance that I'll be back at the same time. We'll plow through another two chapters. We're not even halfway through the book yet, so there's a lot of good stuff in there to come, I am sure. Um, yeah, I don't really have much more to say right now. If you haven't yet, please watch the first three parts. Very interesting context, lots of valuable nuggets and information that will help you understand this video and subsequent ones. But other than that, I hope you are all well. Take care of yourselves and each other. And until the next one, God bless.